Hello and welcome back to the Future Value Podcast. John Pellosie, as always, joined by Joe Freemont and Justin Ahner. We're happy to have you with us today, and this might be our most controversial podcast to date, I'll say. That's a little bit of hype, but hey, what's a podcast without a little bit of hype up, right? We're talking about debt. We're going to get into really a series of videos we have planned talking about all different areas around the topic of debt, strategy, some thoughts and mindset that goes into it. We'll cover all of that. But today is really more of a debt 101. We're going to give an overview of some key topics that we will continue to develop in later episodes. So stay tuned for hopefully some helpful information about debt and how you can help use it to your advantage and not let it abuse you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my teammates to get us rolling.
Sure. So given that this is a 101 crash course on debt, we think that it's only right to begin with, what is debt? Most of us are familiar with the concept, but if for some reason you're not, Merriam-Webster defines debt as a state of being under obligation to pay or repay someone or something in return for something received. So that's our textbook definition. But really, what does that mean for most of us? You owe somebody something for something that you've already received in advance.
Right. And hopefully if you clicked on the video or if you're clicking on LinkedIn or joining us elsewhere, you hopefully know what debt is if you clicked on this episode, right? But I think when it comes to debt, it's important to have the right mindset surrounding it, right? Because debt is really not your friend. It's a tool, right? And we think about that a lot when we do our financial planning process, right? There's several tools available to us, right? But without the blueprint, right, it's not necessarily the right thing, right? You don't know if you're using the right tools. And Justin, you're very familiar with building a house or maybe using some of those tools, and you don't get too far if you don't have the right blueprint, right?
Correct. Yeah, just like any tool, you have to use it correctly. There are wrong ways to use a hammer,
yes.
And in the wrong hands, they can be very destructive.
Absolutely.
As can debt if it is mismanaged.
So we talk a lot about, and we've had a previous episode on the effect of compound interest, right? When you put money away for your future or for your retirement, and hopefully you are doing that, taking advantage of your employer-sponsored plan or what that you have. But compound interest, when it's working for you, is really what builds your wealth, right? Mm-hmm. But in the same way that it can build your wealth, it can also destroy your financial picture, right? Mm-hmm. When working against you. So we have to be very careful when we enter into debt agreements on making sure that we're in responsible forms of debt. So John hinted that this might be a controversial episode, and right, there's a lot of financial gurus out there that have very strong feelings about how you should use debt or how you should not use debt.
It seems to be one extreme or the other a lot of times, right?
Yeah. You absolutely can't have it, or you can in certain situations, right? But I think we should clarify here that we're not anti-debt, right? If you have debt, we're not going to shame you for having debt, right? It's very reasonable to have forms of debt. Sometimes you might have even entered into a debt agreement before you even really knew what you were doing, right? In the case of student loans, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what we're really going to do, and when John, Justin, and I go through our financial planning clients' reports, right, we're kind of looking at a couple key different types of debt when we look at their balance sheet. So there's two forms of debt that we typically look at, and that's good debt versus bad debt. And you might say, oh, there's good and bad debt. Yes, that might be a controversial statement too, but in our opinion, there is good and bad debt, right? Good debt, examples of good debt, and we have a little illustration that we'll show you up on the screen here, but we have education loans, right? Investing in yourself, right? And we'll cover that a little bit more later, but also there's home loans, right? If you want to buy a home, the American dream of buying a home someday, right? Nobody, or for the most part, if you're getting started, pays cash for their first home, right? Statistically. And there's also business loans, right? If you're going to go into business for yourself and start your own small business or what you have, a business loan is considered a type of good debt. So those are examples of good debt, but what is bad debt, right? Well, credit cards, when not used properly, can be very deadly forms of debt. Mm-hmm. In addition to cars, right? I know that might be a controversial thing too, because, hey, listen, you need a car to get to your job, right? It's getting from point A to point B. But other types of consumer debts, I'm thinking payday loans, I'm thinking
Right.
any loan that you might take to get something that you can't afford, right? So from there, let's kind of get more into good debt, right? Let's start with the good, and maybe we'll kind of dive into the bad debt a little bit more from there. But Justin, how do we define good debt?
So good debt is typically seen as something that's productive or increasing in value. So for education, student loans, for example, you're investing in yourself. You're trying to build your wealth of knowledge and therefore increase your value as an employee and ultimately your earnings potential.
Right.
Additionally, like a mortgage, you're investing in an appreciating asset. It's gaining value, and you're also locking in your number one budget expense item, which is housing for most people.
You got it. Well, I think we should clarify on the education debt there, right? When we say that you're investing in yourself, we're making sure that you're doing the research when you're looking into your major, right? And we'll have a whole other episode on the return on investment on when you're selecting your major for our younger folks in the audience here. But we're not talking about majoring in basket weaving, right? Because the return on investment, if you go to a 4-year school for basket weaving, is probably not that great. Maybe you didn't have to go to college for basket weaving, right? But studies show that on average, the more that you invest in your education, the more over your lifetime that you're, on average, you earn in your life. And we have another illustration that we're going to show you here from Educational Attainment that shows the different levels of education that you achieve and what your lifetime earnings may be, right? And what we'll see here is that if you look, if you've not earned your high school diploma, your total lifetime earnings are just under $1 million, $973,000 is your average lifetime earnings if you don't finish your high school degree, right? And just by finishing high school, that average earnings for your whole life goes up by $300,000, just a little bit over that, which is quite incredible, right? I mean, just by finishing those 4 years, a dramatic increase in lifetime earnings, right? But let's take that one step further, and let's just say, hey, you know what? You go to a school and you earn your bachelor's degree. Well, you could see here, according to our chart, $2.26 million compared to if you hadn't even finished high school, you're under $1 million, right? That's over $1 million more just by earning that degree. And again, we're not talking about getting a degree in basket weaving, right? We're talking about getting a degree that has a solid return on investment.
Yeah, and I think that, Joe, you've got a great point there when we talk about the education piece. There's so much that goes into it. We'll talk a lot about that probably in our standalone education piece. But the reality is a lot of people have been successful, having their own business. Maybe they didn't go to college. They came into, the entrepreneurial arena and have made their work do well for them, even with the lack of a college education. But there's also the reality that some very kind of high level or advanced professions, we think of things like engineering and certain other practices. You just need to have that. You need to have that education. They just won't let you in without it, right? So in that situation, right, using student loans to achieve that makes sense, right? Because you're investing in a highly productive and profitable, hopefully, career for you. And I think that's the key. I always like to emphasize with clients, as we'll go over in our education episode, it's if we're going to be taking out student loans for education, it better be for something that there's going to be a return on as far as a compensation in your career.
Absolutely. I hope my doctor finished high school and went to college and all that,
Yes.
right? You don't want a doctor that didn't do that, right? So another type of good debt that we've been talking a lot about is a mortgage, right? So again, most people, when they go to buy their first home, let alone another home, they typically don't buy entirely in cash unless maybe Dave Ramsey's on their Baby Steps program here. But most people need to put a down payment down, and they take out either a 15 or a 30-year mortgage on their home. And as Justin pointed out expertly before, is that you lock in your set expenses of living, right? You have to have somewhere to live, or at least I hope you do, right? And by having a mortgage, you lock in that payment for the principal and interest there.
So when you say, Joe, just to ask, when you say kind of locking in, you're locking in the principal and interest, you're locking in your living cost. what would that be in comparison to?
Right. Well, typically, unless you're living with your parents, right, you're renting somewhere, right? So maybe you're renting a 1-bedroom apartment, which these days can be quite pricey, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it only gets more expensive from there, as I'm sure many people are aware, right? But when we talk about locking it in, we're directly comparing that to renting and buying.
Oh, so in other words, the cost increases, the rent increases that you could experience if you're in an apartment. With the mortgage, what that monthly payment is going to be. You don't have to worry about that escalating in the same way, right?
You got it. When it comes to principal and interest, right? If your home appreciates, which we're going to get into here, kind of in the differences between renting and home buying, right? When you're a homeowner, you get charged real estate taxes, right? That's based on the fair market value, correct me if I'm wrong, on your property, right? And that might go up as your house appreciates, right? But the difference is when you're renting, you don't own the apartment that you're in on average, right? In that same way, when you buy the home, you're buying an appreciating asset, right? Which qualifies it as good debt. That's not to say that home ownership is super easy and it's always the best thing, right? There's very, really big expenses that come with home ownership, right? And John, I'm sure you have several experiences with that, right?
Oh yeah, and as someone in your 20s, when you buy your first house, it's funny how quickly you kind of become your parents too, and you kind of like grouse over all of the things that you have to do to take. But it is rewarding to be a homeowner. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There are major expenses that can come up as part of maintaining that property. That goes back to the importance of cash management and having a cash reserve, which we've talked about in the past. But to your point, Joe, yes, you do benefit from the fact that over long term, real estate is an appreciating asset. And it's been one of the main ways that people have passed on wealth, through generations to their families.
Absolutely. So with that, we're going to take a little example. I've done a little calculation here from our friends at calculator.net. They have a way to calculate when you're making that decision that maybe, hey, I've got enough money on the sidelines outside of my emergency fund. I'm thinking about buying a home. Well, how long do I need to stay in that home to make sure that it's worthwhile for me for the long-term future, right? So as always, a home purchase, when you're buying a home, it should be a long-term vision, right? And I'm sure we all have those friends that are like, oh, I'm going to buy this home and maybe I'm going to leave in a year or two, right? Well, if we're thinking long-term here, a home purchase should really be maybe 5 years or more when we're looking at it, because the closing costs, which not many people think about when they're buying a home, right? Everyone focuses on that down payment, are not small, right? They're a material part of that home purchase. So what we have for you here is we have a simulated example here where we're going to go through. If you had the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment here in the state of Pennsylvania, which is $1,750, wow. That's not what it used to be, right? And we are going to assume that on average that rent increases by 3% every year with inflation, right? We know that inflation over long periods of times averages about 2.5% to 3% over the long term. We're going to assume that your renter's insurance is about $20 per month. And I know all these insurance companies usually advertise $15, but if you're on a monthly payment cycle, there's some fees for doing that, right? So we're going to assume that it's $20 and that you have to put a security deposit down of 1 month's rent and some upfront costs to get in of about $1,000 here. Contrasting that to your home purchase, we're going to assume that you're buying a $300,000 home. You put down $20,000, which is 6.7%. Your interest rate at the time of recording is about 6.5%, right? Which is pretty good. Assumes that you have a pretty good credit report there, and we're assuming you're taking that out for 30 years, right? We also have a couple assumptions here on the amount of property taxes that you're going to pay, any home insurance that you have to pay, and et cetera there. So we're being conservative, intentionally conservative here to make sure that everything looks, it might look better in your situation depending on where you're going here. But what we can see is that over 9.4 years, the break even, right, of where it might be cheaper is buying, right? Over the long term, to support our before part here is that if you stay in that home for more than 9.4 years, you're going to be overall, you're going to be in a better situation than if you rented over that same period of time.
Right.
Yeah, that's really great, Joe. I know a lot of people, they like to look at things like that, and it's like, oh, what actually makes sense for me? And this is a really great illustration that shows kind of where that break even is. Before we move on to moving into some of the bad debts, some additional good debts that I know we've touched briefly on, but are worth mentioning again. HELOCs, home equity lines of credit, when they are used for productive purposes. Again, getting back to that tool conversation that we had, certainly there's good ways to use debt and bad ways to use debt, and specifically for those HELOCs, if you're investing in the property or investing in additional real estate, that is one productive way to use that line of credit. Similarly, home equity loans, which typically are used for repairs on the property, again, another productive debt, increasing the value of your property. And Joe did touch on small business loans as well. Again, investing in yourself, investing in an appreciating asset that will hopefully generate income for you down the line.
Great. So now that we've talked about all the good, right? Starting with the good, we're going to kind of finish up here with the bad, right? And the ugly, as I would say. So bad debt is money borrowed to purchase rapidly depreciating assets, right? Things that I think of that stand out immediately is maybe you bought something that is, maybe some goods or something that you probably thought, oh, well, I can't afford that TV right now during Black Friday, but you know what? I'll put it on my credit card and it'll hopefully be worth what it is when I maybe don't want it anymore, right? Or maybe something that you just throw out when it's done with use.
Like you buy just the buy now, pay later mindset, right? Okay.
You got it. So I think, when we think about bad debt, our society really focuses on instant gratification, right? If you can't afford it right now, well, get a credit card or get a loan for it. You can have it right now. You can pay for it later, right? It kind of rewards that instant gratification, right? When in reality, I think maybe we should be focusing more on delayed gratification, which we got on more in our compound or future value episode. So with that, we're going to focus on the main offender, as I would say, which is the credit cards, and probably the most controversial thing that we have going on here. But a credit card is a line of credit that you establish with a bank or a credit union or a financial institution that provides you with the opportunity to earn certain rewards on a certain percentage basis, depending on the type of transaction that you have. They typically have variable rates of interest, and actually, in our time in the industry, it's actually changed over the last couple of years, which has been very interesting to see. But as of the time of this recording, the average interest rate on a credit card is anywhere from 22% to 29% interest. Which is absolutely crazy. I mean, we get very excited over here when we see our assets go up by maybe averaging 10, maybe 11% in tandem with the S&P 500 over a long period of time. Can you only imagine how excited we would be if we could guarantee a 22 to 29%? I mean, we'd be very, very happy campers.
Right.
So I think the important thing with credit cards is to make sure that we have some best practices when we use them, right? It is, again, not your friend, right? It is a tool that you should be using properly, right? So the rewards that these companies promise you are simply not worth it if you carry a balance month to month over. That 4% that you're earning on maybe Amazon purchases on your card is not worth it if you're paying 22 to 29% interest, right? That is not in your favor, right? So when we see our credit card balance, we should be making sure that we're paying that statement balance in full. In fact, pay off the whole thing if you can, right? If you don't have the money, don't spend it. There's a beautiful SNL clip where it's called "If You Don't Have Money, Don't Spend It," and they've got a whole pamphlet. And I was showing the gentleman here before we got on here, and they're like, "Wait, so you're telling me if I don't have money, I shouldn't spend it? That doesn't make any sense, right?" So treat your credit card like you have the money in the bank, right? Treat it like a debit card. You should have that money on reserve. You should be able to pay it, right? You should not be buying things that you know that you cannot afford with this credit card. So part of the ways that we can make that very easy is that most credit card companies, everyone that I've had, has an automatic feature to pay that balance. Now, I'm inherently I'm on the, hey, I want to make sure I automatically manually pay it. But you can set up and make sure that you're paying that statement balance every month for your credit cards. So make sure you're not paying the minimum balance, but you're paying the full statement balance for your credit card.
Right. I think other things, when I think about the credit card, Joe, is, I've heard some financial folks will go so far as to say, you know what, don't even use credit cards at all, because even though there's rewards, and even if you pay it in full every month, you still might be tempted to spend more than you normally would, right? Mm-hmm. Spend more than you would if you were just paying cash or just writing checks or whatever the case may be. I think everyone has to kind of make that decision for themselves. Mm-hmm. I'll share it, and I'd be interested to hear from the two of you. I mean, I do use credit cards, and I make sure to always pay them in full on the statement balance. For me, I think that I've hopefully done a good job of not spending more just because it's a credit card. But I do think it's something everyone has to decide on. How about for the two of you? Kind of what's been your thought process?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely fallen victim to that. Oh, I'll just put it on the credit card on a handful of occasions, and it's unfortunate. But the companies, like, I hate to pick on Amazon for example, but they save your information. And then they have that buy now button. Yeah. It's one click away, right. So you might be that impulse buy of, oh man, I really wanted that particular item. It's on sale. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna get it, and then buy now. And then even 30 minutes later, sometimes I've questioned, like, did I really need that?
Right.
Did I really need to spend that amount of money on that particular item?
Mm-hmm.
So it certainly is very easy to fall into that trap. But for the most part, I think it's just having that discipline to say, if I had cash in my hand, would I spend it on this item? Mm-hmm. And having that discipline to say, no, I'm not going to put it on the credit card. And as Joe mentioned, making sure that you have the money to back it up.
Right.
Not, oh geez, man, I think I have maybe a couple $100 in my bank account. Now I'm going to have a $1,000 credit card bill coming up this month. That math doesn't add up, right. Unfortunately.
Math ain't mathin', Justin. I think you had a lot of great points, Justin, there. I use my credit cards a lot for recurring expenses, right? So at the grocery, when I go for groceries every week, I'm putting it on the credit card because I know that there's a line item in my budget that allows for that amount, and I know that I'm going to have the money to pay for that, right? Mm-hmm. Subscriptions are on my credit card, and I have to say, we talked about wedding finances and combining that in another episode, which is a reference. If you haven't seen that yet, you should go see it. But I have to say that putting everything on that credit card has actually made the transition to joining accounts very, very easy, because I don't have to change on every little thing to say, hey, you know what, I got to go and put in my bank information or get the debit card changed and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to sing the credit card's praises there, but also I'm just going to say that, you can have multiple cards, and I've also been the trying to win on the point game, right? Everyone's obsessed with points, but at the end of the day, those are bonuses, right? I'm not using the credit card because, I'm trying to get the points. I'm using the credit card because it makes everything administratively very easy. And by the way, I happen to get a couple $100 maybe a year on returns for that. It's not the primary objective of that card.
Yeah. And two other things I kind of want to talk about here that I think they're almost like adjacent to credit cards. And I think that they've come out kind of more recently, or at least in the last couple of years. And those two things are kind of the pay installments or breakup payment systems. And then one is kind of 0% financing on certain purchases. So, I think we all often, especially shopping online, will see these kind of pay and installment things. So it's not using a credit card per se, but it's, breaking up a payment. Maybe it's 4 payments or something like that. And, there's no interest attached to it. It just breaks it up into chunks. I know some people who take advantage of that all the time, but I also know people who it's been their alternative to credit cards, and the problem is they're still spending money they don't have, right? So they're still getting into this trap of kind of living above their means using the system. And by the way, some of those things also I have seen start to charge interest if you don't get those payments paid in time. So I think it's very similar also with the 0% financing thing. So, right, like a lot of times if you make a bigger purchase, maybe it's a I don't know, a fridge, a sofa. I'm thinking of a sofa I bought a few years ago that had 0% financing. I think the mindset that I would recommend for clients to that is very similar to the credit card, right? If you have the cash that you could have just paid it in that one payment, in my mind, if you want to break it up, that's fine. That's what I've done for myself and said, listen, I can buy the sofa in cash, or I could have interest-free payments for 2 years and use, again, taking advantage of compounding interest. I could use that money to do something else and earn more money for myself. I think that's an okay way to approach it. But if it's just kind of this crutch of, I can't afford this thing in my lifestyle, but I can break it into payments, I think that's still a problem and something I personally would recommend people avoid doing.
I think that's a great point, John, but I think the key distinguisher there is that at any given moment, you probably could have paid that sofa off,
yes,
right?
100%.
And that's
important.
That's the important part, right? It's not that, I'm going to take this money that I would have put on my sofa and I'm going to go put it in the S&P 500. Well, no, it's, hey, I have the reserves. It can be paid off at any moment, but there's other things that I can do in that
the flexibility.
It's the flexibility, right? And I think you got to be careful with these pay over times, because before you know it, if you're doing it all the time, you might be loaded up with a ton of payments that aren't even in your budget that you're like, oh, wow, well, I've got the sofa, I've got the new gaming system, I've got a TV, I've got X, Y, and Z, and all of a sudden you've got $200, $300, $400 of payments that you are loading yourself up with. So gotta be careful. Yeah.
And I think one other, just a quick tech budget tip for people, especially if you're struggling, if you're somebody who has sometimes trouble with credit cards, and that again can run kind of a whole spectrum. But one of the easy things, a little bit like Justin was talking about earlier, is not to save your card into online shops like Amazon or like anything, right? So this is a technique I've seen people use where they'll make themselves enter all of their credit card info in every time they want to make a payment for a purchase online. It's a pain in the butt, right? There's a reason we all save our card info, because we don't want to go through that process. But by going through that, for those people, it helps create that just kind of layer of delay, really, right? A layer of delay for them to think about that purchase. And that might help them from making a purchase that they ultimately didn't really want or need or didn't have value in. So if you're watching out there, if you're someone who's ever struggled with impulse buys online, I think that's probably one of the first things that you can do to help maybe correct that pattern is don't save the credit card info. Make yourself put it in. That way it's really something you want to spend money on.
I like to think with credit cards, and we'll wrap up on credit cards with this, is that really I think there's two types of people in this world, and this might be a little harsh, but you're either a credit card person or you're not, really. If you can't responsibly have a balance that you can pay off every month with a credit card, you really ought to consider maybe deactivating the card or maybe hibernating it and saying it's not going to be spent on anything, maybe keeping it open for your credit history purposes.
Right.
But you should really use a debit card, because that is going to teach you, hey, when I make purchases, that is real money that I'm spending. It's so easy to just tap the card. It's so easy just to swipe your card, right? If you keep the mindset that if I had cash in my pocket right now, would I be handing out over all the $20 bills that I'd be spending, right? And that's the mindset that you need to have with credit cards, because in reality, if you don't have it, don't spend it, right?
That's right.
Awesome. So another type of loans that might be considered bad debt is when it comes to cars, right? And we're going to have a whole other episode on buying a car and what you should be considering before you go up to that, and that'll be a future episode, like I said. But cars are a necessity, right? Especially in this world where you really can't bike anywhere in the United States. If you're from outside the United States, there are plenty of places where you could probably walk or bike to. But for those of us who don't live in major cities or places where there's public transportation, you need to have a car, right? And I think it's important to notice that when you buy a car, the minute you roll it off the lot, it's already losing value, right? It's a depreciating asset. And for those of us who have older cars, we know just how expensive maintenance can be on that, right? But an interesting statistic that I noticed recently, and I think it's a baffling one, and I'm curious to see what you guys are thinking about this, is that the average car payment for a new car is $730 a month according to Bankrate. For new cars, $730 a month.
So that's the average for just. Oh wow. Okay.
If you bought a new car today and you rolled it off $730 a month, and a used car, it's not much better. $520 a month. And usually we think used cars are the
budget
more
option,
affordable.
right? Right. Wow.
And what we know, right? And if you go back to our future value episode, right? We know that if you have just used that for something else, maybe by maxing out your Roth IRA or putting that money into your 401k, what the power of that can really be over the long term, right? So when we look at a cars, we need to be very careful about what we are signing up for when it comes to that payment, right? So I think the important part is when, and we'll get to this more in a future episode, but making sure that you're the one driving the car and the car is not driving you.
That's a good point. I like that.
So just to go off that, and again, we'll cover it more in another episode, but the type of a car that you can afford is different depending on what age you are, right? If you're in your 20s and you just rolled out of college, avoid the trap. Don't buy. I'm going to throw my dad under the bus here. My dad bought a brand new Jeep when he graduated from pharmacy school. And he says it to this day, and he admits it, and if he's watching this, hi, Dad. It was the dumbest decision he could have ever made because he loaded himself not only with student loans, but now he had a car payment as well. Right. So the car that you can afford in your 20s is completely different than your 30s, 40s, 50s, and more.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to cars, it's very interesting. There are people who don't care at all about the car they drive. It gets them to point A to point B, and that's fine. And it's funny, it applies to people all across the income levels too. So it's not just based on your income. I know plenty of very wealthy people who do not care at all about the kind of car that they drive. But I think it's one of those things, and debt, I think, touches on a lot of this, where it can really be fueled by comparison, right? Like you go online, you check out social media, you see what, the influencers are driving or celebrities are driving or how they're living, and it can really kind of work on you a little bit to want to keep up with that. And I think it's important, especially in cars, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but maybe I'm speaking for other people too. You got to focus on yourself, right? And what makes sense for you. And I think, to your point, Joe, it should be one of those things where you're taking care of a lot of the other financial pieces of your, of your life, right? Are you saving for retirement? Are you saving for the things you should be? Do you have your emergency funds, right? And making sure all of that is addressed before you get into, the status or the level of the car that you're going to be driving. Because at the end of the day, as you said, even the most valuable cars, almost without exception, will depreciate over time. It's a tool, it's a machine, again, to be used. So we just have to make sure we're being smart about it.
You bring up a great point, John. Comparison is the thief of joy. And make sure that you're not keeping up with the Jones and screwing yourself over for your future financial success. Right.
All righty. Well, thank you everyone for joining us in our Debt 101. We've got a lot more to come on specific areas of debt, where we'll get into even more detail about different types of debts in different areas of your life, and perhaps most interestingly, what is a good debt pay down strategy and way to, again, make sure debt is not controlling you, you're using it as a tool for its best purpose. Thanks again for joining us on the Future Value Podcast. We'll see you soon.